In 1735, a ship called the Göteborg left the harbour at Gothenburg, Sweden, loaded with silver. Its destination was Canton, China. Its mission was simple: bring back tea. The voyage would take over a year each way, through pirate-infested waters around the southern tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Entire crews died of scurvy, shipwrecks, and disease on these journeys, and they did it for dried leaves. That sounds insane. But the fact that people risked everything, bankrupted nations, started wars, and literally redrew the map of the world over a plant you can buy for $3 at any grocery store today tells you something. Tea is not just a drink. It never was. So how did a wild shrub growing in the mountains of southwestern China become the most consumed beverage on the planet after water? How did it topple dynasties, fuel revolutions, and reshape global trade for centuries? This story begins almost 5,000 years ago in a place most people have never heard of, Yunnan Province, China. Around 2700 BC, according to Chinese legend, Emperor Shen Nung was sitting beneath a wild tea tree while his servants boiled water for him to drink. A few leaves blew from the branches overhead and drifted into the pot. Shen Nung, who was known as a herbalist and curious experimenter, decided to taste the accidental brew rather than throw it away. He liked it. Now, that story is almost certainly a myth. Shen Nung himself may not have been a real person in the way we think of historical figures, but the core of the legend lines up with what archaeologists and botanists have confirmed. The Camellia sinensis plant, the single species responsible for all tea, green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, all of it, originated in the Yunnan region of southwestern China. People in that area were chewing tea leaves and brewing primitive versions of the drink thousands of years before anyone in Europe even knew the plant existed. For centuries, tea was primarily medicine. Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, reference tea as a treatment for everything from headaches and digestive problems to fatigue. People ground the leaves into pastes, pressed them into bricks, and boiled pieces of those bricks in water with salt, ginger, and sometimes onion. If you ordered that version of tea at a coffee shop today, you would probably spit it out. The transformation from a bitter medicinal brew into something people actually enjoyed drinking for pleasure happened slowly, over hundreds of years. But the real turning point came during the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. This is where a man named Lu Yu enters the story. Lu Yu was an orphan raised by Buddhist monks who became obsessed with tea. Not just with drinking it, but with studying it. He spent years traveling across China, visiting tea-growing regions, documenting preparation methods, and cataloging different water sources. In 760 AD, he published a book called the Cha Jing, or the Classic of Tea. It was the first known book in human history devoted entirely to tea. The Classic of Tea covered everything: how to grow tea, how to process the leaves, what kind of water produced the best flavor, and what vessels should be used for brewing. Lu Yu transformed tea from a casual folk remedy into an art form, complete with rules, techniques, and philosophy. The Tang Dynasty emperor was so impressed that tea became a taxable commodity for the first time. The government realized that if everyone was drinking this stuff, they could make a fortune by regulating it. And they did. But this is where tea's story became much bigger than China. Buddhist monks had been drinking tea for centuries to stay alert during long meditation sessions. As Buddhism spread along trade routes into Korea and Japan, the monks brought tea with them. In Japan, tea arrived around the 8th century. A Buddhist monk named Eichu is credited with serving tea to Emperor Saga in 815 AD. The emperor liked it so much that he ordered tea plants to be cultivated near the capital. But Japanese tea culture truly exploded a few hundred years later when another monk named Eisai brought powdered green tea, Matcha, back from China in 1191. Eisai wrote his own book about tea's health benefits and promoted it among the samurai warrior class as a way to stay focused and disciplined. The samurai loved it. Over the next few centuries, the Japanese tea ceremony, known as chanoyu, evolved into one of the most refined cultural rituals in human history. A 16th-century tea master named Sen no Rikyu codified the ceremony into its most celebrated form, emphasizing four principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Every movement, every gesture, and every placement of the cup had meaning. The tea room itself was deliberately small, sometimes only 4.5 tatami mats, roughly 81 square feet. That meant even the most powerful warlords had to bow low when entering. Rank and status were left at the door. The ceremony was about presence, respect, and finding beauty in simplicity. Meanwhile, back in China, tea culture continued evolving. The Tang Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279, shifted from boiled brick tea to whisked powdered tea. Then, during the Ming Dynasty, beginning in 1368, loose-leaf tea became the standard. People began steeping whole leaves in hot water, which is essentially how most of the world drinks tea today. By this point, tea was flowing along the Silk Road and maritime trade routes into Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the edges of Europe. Traders in places like Samarkand and Istanbul were buying and selling Chinese tea alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. But Europeans themselves were late to the party. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to encounter tea through their trading posts in Macau in the early 1500s, but they treated it as a curiosity, not a major commodity. The Dutch were the ones who recognized the business opportunity. By 1610, Dutch traders were importing tea from China and Japan into Amsterdam. Within a few decades, tea drinking had spread among wealthy European elites. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1662, King Charles II of England married a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza. Catherine was already a devoted tea drinker. She brought her tea habit with her to the English court, and suddenly, drinking tea became fashionable among the English aristocracy. If the Queen was doing it, everyone wanted to do it. Within a generation, tea went from an exotic foreign novelty to the national drink of England. Tea houses appeared across London, and the British East India Company, which had previously focused heavily on spices and textiles, realized that tea could become its most profitable product. And that profit motive is where the story turns dark. The British East India Company had a serious problem. China was the world's primary source of tea, and China did not want British goods in return. The Chinese emperor famously told King George III that China possessed all things and had no use for British manufactures. The trade was overwhelmingly one-directional. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for tea, and the imbalance was becoming a national crisis. So Britain found something China did want: opium. British traders, operating through the East India Company, began growing opium poppies in India and smuggling massive quantities of opium into China. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium, and the social devastation was catastrophic. When the Chinese government attempted to stop the trade and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of British opium in Canton Harbour in 1839, Britain used the confrontation as a pretext for war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. Britain won decisively, forcing China to open 5 ports to foreign trade and seize Hong Kong. The Second Opium War followed from 1856 to 1860 with similar results. The wars, the addiction crisis, and the colonial seizure of territory were driven in large part by Britain's desperate need to keep the tea flowing without bankrupting itself. But the British had another plan running simultaneously. They wanted to break China's monopoly on tea production entirely. In 1848, the East India Company hired a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune and sent him on what might be one of the most consequential acts of corporate espionage in history. Fortune shaved his head, grew out a braided queue, dressed in traditional Chinese clothing, and traveled with 2 Chinese servants who helped him pass as a mandarin from a distant province. He journeyed deep into the closely guarded tea-growing regions of Fujian and the Wuyi Mountains, areas where foreigners were strictly forbidden. Fortune did not simply grab a few plants and run. He spent months studying how tea was processed, learning the secrets of oxidation, firing, and rolling that Chinese producers had perfected over centuries and guarded fiercely. He collected more than 20,000 tea seedlings and approximately 17,000 germinated seeds. He packed them into specially designed glass cases called Wardian cases, which kept the plants alive during long ocean voyages. He also recruited 8 Chinese tea experts, men who understood the processing techniques the British had tried and failed to replicate on their own, and convinced them to relocate to India. Fortune brought everything to the Darjeeling region in the foothills of the Himalayas, where elevations reach 7,000 feet and cool mountain mist creates ideal growing conditions. He also sent plants to the Assam region of northeastern India, where a wild variety of the tea plant had already been discovered growing naturally in 1823. Within 20 years, Indian tea production exploded. British-owned plantations in Assam, Darjeeling, and later Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, were producing enough tea to supply the entire British Empire. China's centuries-old monopoly on tea had been broken. But the cost was enormous, and the British were not the ones paying it. Plantation labor in India and Ceylon was brutal. Workers, many of them Tamil migrants brought to Ceylon from southern India, worked grueling hours for almost nothing. Entire communities were uprooted and transplanted to serve the tea industry. Conditions on many plantations were closer to forced labor than free employment, and the social scars from that era persist in those regions to this day. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Now, while the British were reshaping the global tea trade through colonialism and corporate espionage, tea was playing a very different role on the other side of the Atlantic. By the 1770s, American colonists were drinking enormous quantities of tea. It was their most popular non-alcoholic beverage. But the British Parliament had imposed a series of taxes on the colonies, including the Tea Act of 1773. The act gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America while retaining a tax the colonists had no say in approving. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. That was roughly 92,000 pounds of tea, worth about $1.7 million in today's money. The Boston Tea Party, as it became known, was one of the defining acts of defiance that led directly to the American Revolution. In a very real sense, tea helped create the United States, and it also helps explain why Americans drink so much coffee. After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea became associated with British loyalty. Patriots switched to coffee as an act of political identity. That cultural shift stuck. To this day, the United States remains one of the few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea. Back in Britain and its empire, tea culture was only accelerating. The afternoon tea tradition, often credited to Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, around 1840, became a fixture of British social life. The story goes that the Duchess felt a sinking feeling of hunger between lunch and dinner, which was served fashionably late, around 8 or 9 at night. She began requesting a tray of tea with bread, butter, and cake in the late afternoon. Then she started inviting friends, and the custom spread rapidly through the upper classes. Within a few decades, tea had become a daily ritual for millions of British people across social classes. Factory workers in Manchester drank strong black tea with milk and sugar. Lords and ladies in country estates drank it from fine china. Tea was the great equalizer in a deeply unequal society. The Industrial Revolution turbocharged tea consumption even further. Tea was cheap. It provided caffeine to keep factory workers alert during grueling shifts, and the boiling water required to brew it killed bacteria that made untreated water dangerous to drink. Some historians argue that tea literally helped make the Industrial Revolution possible by keeping workers alive and productive. By the late 1800s, tea was the lifeblood of the British Empire. It was grown in India and Ceylon, shipped on British vessels, traded through British ports, and consumed in British homes at a rate of roughly £6 per person per year. The shipping itself became a spectacle. In the 1850s and 1860s, the great tea clipper ships raced each other from China to London, competing to deliver the first cargo of the new season's tea. The fastest ship earned a premium price. The most famous race, in 1866, saw 5 clippers leave Fuzhou on the same day and arrive in London 99 days later, with the Taiping beating the Ariel by just 20 minutes after a 14,000-mile voyage. Crowds gathered at the docks to watch the ships arrive. Newspapers covered the races like sporting events. Tea had become entertainment. Then came the 20th century, and tea started changing again. In 1904, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri, a tea merchant named Richard Bletchenden had a problem. He was trying to sell hot tea to fairgoers, but the summer heat was brutal, and nobody wanted a steaming cup of anything. So he dumped ice into the tea and served it cold. Iced tea was born. Today, roughly 80% of the tea consumed in the United States is iced, and it remains one of America's most popular beverages despite the country's overall preference for coffee. Around the same time, the tea bag was making its entrance. In 1908, a New York tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan began sending tea samples to customers in small silk pouches. The customers, not realizing they were supposed to empty the tea out, simply dunked the entire pouch into hot water. It worked. Sullivan switched to cheaper gauze bags, and the tea bag industry was born. Tea purists, especially in China and Japan, still look at tea bags the way Italian chefs might look at canned spaghetti sauce. But for the average consumer, tea bags made brewing a cup almost effortless, and that convenience drove consumption to record levels worldwide. The 20th century also saw tea culture evolve and diversify around the globe. In India, chai became the national drink, a spiced tea brewed with milk, sugar, cardamom, ginger, and sometimes cloves and cinnamon. Chai wallahs, street vendors selling freshly brewed chai, became as iconic to Indian cities as hot dog stands are to New York. In Morocco, mint tea became a cornerstone of hospitality. Refusing a cup of mint tea in a Moroccan home is considered deeply impolite. The tea is poured from a great height to create a frothy top, and it is served 3 times, with each cup representing a different value. In Turkey, tea replaced coffee as the national drink in the early 20th century after the Ottoman Empire lost control of coffee-producing regions. Turkish tea, called chai, is brewed incredibly strong in a double-stacked teapot and served in small, tulip-shaped glasses. Turkey now consumes more tea per person than almost any other country on Earth, at over £6.5 per person per year. In Tibet and the Himalayan regions, butter tea, made by churning tea with yak butter and salt, has been a caloric staple for centuries. At elevations above 14,000 feet, where farming is limited and the cold is extreme, butter tea provides essential fat, calories, and hydration. And then there is the matcha explosion. For centuries, matcha was a niche product reserved mainly for Japanese tea ceremonies and Buddhist monasteries. But starting around 2010, matcha went global. Matcha lattes began appearing in coffee shops across the United States and Europe. Health food stores marketed matcha as a superfood loaded with antioxidants. Social media filled with photos of bright green matcha drinks, matcha ice cream, and matcha pastries. By 2020, the global matcha market was worth nearly $4 billion and growing rapidly. A ceremonial tradition practiced by Buddhist monks for more than 800 years had become a modern wellness trend. Today, tea is produced in more than 50 countries across every habitable continent. China remains the world's largest producer, followed by India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. Global tea production exceeds 6.5 million tons per year, and more than 2 billion people drink tea every day. That is nearly a quarter of the human population starting their morning with the same ancient ritual. The scale of modern tea production is staggering. In Kenya, tea is the country's single largest export crop and employs more than 3 million people. In Assam, India, there are more than 800 tea estates covering roughly 770,000 acres. The tea industry generates more than $200 billion annually worldwide, and every single leaf, whether it is a high-altitude Darjeeling first flush picked by hand at dawn or a commodity-grade tea bag manufactured by machine, comes from the same plant species, Camellia sinensis. The differences come from what happens to the leaves after they are picked. Green tea is heated quickly to prevent oxidation. Black tea is fully oxidized. Oolong falls somewhere in between. White tea is the least processed of them all. One plant, thousands of variations, 5,000 years of history. Tea began as an accident, a few leaves blowing into a pot of boiling water in the mountains of Yunnan. It became a medicine, then a luxury, then a tool of empire, then a catalyst for revolution, and finally an everyday ritual for billions of people. The cup you brew tomorrow morning connects you to Tang Dynasty, scholars debating the ideal water temperature, to Japanese samurai perfecting the art of presence, and to British soldiers in the trenches of World War I brewing tea under artillery fire, because that is what you do when the world is falling apart. You make tea. During both World Wars, the British government considered tea so essential to morale that it was one of the first items rationed to guarantee its supply. Winston Churchill himself reportedly said that tea was more important to his soldiers than ammunition. The wars fought over this leaf, the espionage committed to control it, and the labor exploited to produce it. All of that history lives inside something most people now treat as completely ordinary. Tea is never just tea. It never was. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe. There are more videos like this one coming, and you will want to be here for them.